I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Representative Chip Roy spoke about the emergency powers of the president. The Texas Republican expressed skepticism about the extraordinary powers the executive can take in an emergency. Roy said that his concern was not based on President Biden being in office, but extended to both parties. Take a listen to his remarks here.
I want to now recognize a man who we have awaited his arrival. He's timed it well. Our honored guest, our most noted member for dealing on this issue in the past, the gentleman from Texas and the University of Virginia, Mr. Roy.
Well, I appreciate the chairman and really do appreciate this hearing and appreciate the witness, appreciate y'all being here. This is an important issue, and as was noted earlier, I believe my friend Mike Lee in the Senate and I worked together to introduce this legislation, the Article 1 Act, in the previous Congress, my first Congress. And I would note when President Trump was president, and I would note it was in response to some degree, and much to the chagrin of some of my supporters back home, with respect to the building defense along the border and the use of emergency power to go down that road. And I'm a strong supporter of needing infrastructure, as is well noted in debates in this committee, and believing that we need a fence and a wall and we need to have infrastructure in the border, in the southern border, to manage that crisis. But I believe in limits to executive power. And I think it's critically important that we do that. And to the point of Mr. Canapano, the reality of politicians kind of flapping in the breeze, I think, a little bit on this, sort of based on the political expediency of the moment of whatever issue you want to accomplish, is a real risk for all of us, both sides of the aisle, no matter who's in power. And that we ought to, this body, find ways to come together to try to constrain the executive within the appropriate lanes under the Constitution, and reassert congressional authority where it's necessary. So the bill is obviously designed to rein in these 40, I think you testified 41, I think I had 43 from CRS, but whatever it is, 40-some emergencies that we're operating on dating back to 1979. It's just patently absurd that we'd be operating under a, quote, emergency for almost as long as I've been alive. I mean, that's an extraordinary reality that we're dealing with. I did want to note, and then I want to throw to some questions to you all, in the current context, and like my friend from Louisiana mentioned, I don't want to break down in a bipartisan feel here. I actually mean this with respect to both President Trump and President Biden. But I'm deeply concerned about the use of emergency powers during this pandemic. Deeply concerned. Not because of the motives involved, not because of whatever disagreements we might have on how power should be, or on the effectiveness of vaccines or so forth, but just literally the power of the government through saying, and by the way, not just through the National Emergencies Act, right, but through the Stafford Act, through the Public Health Service Act, and other powers granted to the executive branch, that we have a situation where the President of the United States can declare an emergency 700 and whatever days ago it was, 792 days ago, and then have that extended by a subsequent president, and then use these acts and have the power of the president and the executive branch say, okay, we've got this problem, this emergency, and under that have the ability for pharmaceutical companies, whether it's Operation Warp Speed to try to get it done, or whether it's the extension under the Biden administration to try to encourage people to take it, to then have liability protection for those companies with a mandate from the government under the auspices of an emergency that people then get said vaccine, and then potentially through the coercion of the power of government say you might lose your job if you don't take said vaccine, if you're in the military and so forth, or a federal worker, Border Patrol, FBI, anybody else, healthcare worker. The extraordinary power of the executive branch doing all that I just said without a single act of Congress to say, yes, go do that. Would the panelists agree that that is a concerning use of emergency power and authority by the executive branch? If you could go quickly, because I got 40 seconds, and I'll sum up, go down the line. Yes or no, roughly?
I'll give you 70 seconds.
Okay, well, thank you, sir.
I'll be very quick. I think that when COVID struck, it was absolutely an emergency. It met the definition. I think broad flexibility for the president and for the federal government was appropriate. I think the question is, where are we now, 2 years after the pandemic? And is there a way to transition now to non-emergency powers? And if the non-emergency powers in place are not sufficient, whether Congress can step in and provide the
Mr.
necessary
Dayton,
authority.
thank you. Ms.
I agree with Ms. Goiteen's comments. I think a critical part of any reform is going to be providing for a way for Congress to act quickly, and I think that's, your bill does that. Obviously, the Protecting Our Democracy Act components on national emergency reform do that, and I think that could be a foundation for building this in other areas. And we've mentioned the National Security Reform Accountability Act as a model that uses this in war powers and arms sales to foreign areas, but you could also think about ways to use this domestically. But I think this is an opportunity to sort of build a foundation, an example that you can use in other areas.
Mr. Canaparo?
Yes, so what you hit on is this problem with the national emergency laws, the whole panoply of them, creates such a draconian and arcane system that these decisions can be made and the ripple effects can ripple outwards without any say-so from Congress and without any input from the people. So the problem really is one of this who decides problem, and it's certainly at this point, because of the way that Congress has delegated so much power, it's not you anymore, and it should be you.
Mr. McCleary, and thanks, Mr. Chairman, for the indulgence.
This is the nut of the problem, and I totally agree with you, and I totally agree with the ranking member that this is the struggle, is to restore the balances of power. President Trump actually made a very intelligent statement that was rather disparaged when he said, I have powers you do not even know about. And that was a great contribution because it opened up this whole discussion, in fact. And you need to move in this legislation that we were talking and achieve the objective that you're talking about. But then we also need to explore, again, what President Trump had introduced, and that is, what are these powers that no one knows about? And they are dictatorial. The fact is the President of the United States has two powers. One, to blow up the world, President Carter, and the second is, with not even a stroke of the pen, blow up the Constitution. And we've got to, as the ranking member points, in our role in saving the Republic, to keep the Republic, we have got to wrestle with these questions. And this is the historical moment to do that. So I really applaud the work that you've been doing, Congressman.
Well, I appreciate you all. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. And I would just note for the committee, for our work as a Constitution subcommittee on a bipartisan basis, that, and I mean this truly, my concern here spans across both presidents from both parties. And the pandemic is a good example because there's an altruistic motive to care for people and ensure that there's a vaccine available and that people can get, and we've had debates about that. But the point here is just the power. Like, who gets to decide? How does that happen? And the importance of congressional action on that. Anyway, I appreciate the extra time from the chairman.